Good morning, friends. This is Paul Thompson at Huntersville United Methodist Church, where I am usually joined by my good friend and colleague, Steve.Autrey. But today, Steve's got a lot on his plate, so we've invited Rod Arders, the associate pastor here at Huntersville United Methodist Church, to join in the conversation. And Rod's been gone for a couple of days having fun. Rod, how are you doing? You look refreshed, renewed. I don't know what to make of that.
I hope I look refreshed. I'm tired, man.
All right. Well, it is good to be with you, and we greet you in the love, grace, and peace of our Lord Jesus Christ. And today we get to talk about certainly one of the most influential books in all of the Bible, one that I think probably most of us know at least parts of by heart. It is the Gospel of John. So Rod's going to be preaching this week and from the Gospel of John, so I know he is all updated and experted. So Rod, let's talk about the Gospel of John. What do you know about the Gospel of John? What's different about the Gospel of John versus Matthew, Mark, and Luke?
Well, good morning. And yeah, John is really different than the other three gospels in lots of ways. And one of the things I think is really fascinating is we call it the book of John. We attribute it to John, but it doesn't specifically say John wrote it. Like at the end of the book, it says that it mentions the disciple whom Jesus loved, which seems to be a reference to John. But I find it fascinating that John is not specifically mentioned in the ways that we'd expect. And in fact, he's not even mentioned in the entire book until chapter 13, where it gets to the Last Supper. He's not mentioned in the kind of the earlier stages of Jesus's ministry. In this book, he is in other books, in other gospels, he is. But you and I, Paul, we've talked offline about one of the brands or one of the attributes of a true Christian is humility. So it makes me wonder if John, in his humility, didn't want to say, I wrote this book, or he just kind
Yeah.
of, didn't put himself into the narrative that, well, I won't speak for you, that I would have put myself into if I was writing this.
Yeah, yeah, the Gospel of Rod.
Yeah, right.
I wrote this. So, well, it is true. Matthew, Mark, and Luke are called the synoptic Gospels. Synoptic meaning one view, and they do pretty much follow the same basic pattern. They have much of the same material. It is pretty clear that scholars believe that Mark was the first gospel written, that Matthew and Luke certainly used Mark, it appears, as resources, as source material. But the Gospel of John seems to be the outlier in the terms of it was written much later. We think as much as 20, 30 years after the other Gospels were written. And it does not appear that Matthew, Mark, or Luke were used as resources for John's Gospel, which is kind of fascinating to me. Um, what do you know about not only about the author of John, but what do we think is the context for the writing of the Gospel of John? Rod, do you
Well,
have any
yeah. Well,
take?
first of all, I wanted to just fall back on something. I think I read somewhere 90% of John's gospel is unique to John,
Mhm.
which is really a really high statistic to me when you break it down. And I know some of the early church fathers. I really found it fascinating that how they described the Book of John. Like Clement of Alexandria, an early church father, called the other gospels talked about physical things, and John wrote a spiritual gospel. And I thought that was really fascinating. Augustine says something similar. He calls the other gospels of the flesh, where John is the gospel of the spirit. And even John Calvin kind of mentions the synoptic gospels are the reveal the body of Jesus, while the Gospel of John reveals his soul. So I just found it really fascinating that they kind of viewed this book in a different way. The context is really fascinating because John does something different with his this book. I'll say it's John. We're going to assume John wrote it, but he does something different with this gospel versus the other ones, where this one's really easy to read in a way kind of unlike the other ones. And I think that's why so many people are given this book. And when you first come to Christ, hey, read the book of John. I've heard that from my earliest memory, John is the book, the go-to book, and I think part of this, it's filled with characters that everybody can relate with. I mean, it's just peppered in there with a bunch of different people that we all identify with. But I've come to appreciate John, um, the longer I've been in the faith. It is a book that you can't exhaust. I mean, it just
All right. On
constantly.
so many different levels,
Yeah.
absolutely. Yeah, it
Um,
seems that, John's gospel was written, like I said, 20, 30 years after, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Seems to be written in response. There is a tension that exists between the Jewish faith, the people in the synagogue, and this newfound Christian expression that believed Jesus was the Messiah of God, and yet there is this natural tension that existed. The Jewish faith says messiahs don't die, but John and those who came to believe that Jesus is the Jewish Messiah believe that it was absolutely that it was the mission that he came for. If you kind of compare Matthew, Mark, and Luke, it almost appears at times that when Jesus dies, it's by this odd design. But in the Gospel of John, it's clear that Jesus says from the very beginning, this is my mission. I came to give my life. No greater love can a person have than to lay down one's life for one's friends. Jesus is quoted in the Gospel of John. So in that tension that existed in those last couple of decades of the or first century, it feels like that John's gospel is a further development of what's called the Christology. Who is this Jesus, and what role does he play, and how are we to understand him as both God's Son, as the Messiah, but also as this one who comes to give to give life. So,
yeah. Yeah,
um,
but and some of the things I've read about John, they seem to divide it into the book into two. There's a book of signs, and then they call it the book of glory. And I think that's kind of what you're talking about with the glory part.
yeah.
And that's probably what the early church fathers are talking about. That Jesus is the spiritual part of the gospel. Is that Jesus wasn't just man, he was also at the same time God. I think that's why John's gospel starts the way it does. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word. He's taking it all the way back that
Mm.
to a beginning of sorts that Jesus has always been. Which John then reveals the I ams. I mean, his gospel is known for the seven I am statements that he's kind of identifying Jesus's identity in this gospel, kind of unlike the other gospels, really. They
Yeah, so as far as that identity goes, that question comes really early in John's gospel. Matthew and Luke have the birth narratives. Mark just kind of dives in, but Matthew and Luke have something of a birth narrative. But John has this fascinating prologue, this
Yeah,
18 verses that in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God, and then down to verse 14 where it says, and the Word becomes flesh and dwells among us, and we've seen his glory, the glory as of only Son from the Father. So let's talk just a moment about the profound implications of that prologue and the statement faith that John is making. In the beginning was the Word. What's the essence of that? What is John trying to say to us there?
I mean, I think John is trying to make the connection where Matthew does more of the genealogy of how Jesus is connected to the Jews, the Jewish background. John is trying to make, I think, the connection between Genesis 1 and Matthew 1,
Yeah,
where
yeah.
in the beginning, Jesus wasn't just a man, he wasn't just a rabbi, he wasn't just a religious leader, he was in essence God, and he went all the way back to the beginning of what we call the beginning. There is no beginning for him, but for our beginning, John's making that connection, and I think he's making it. He's connecting it so vividly. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was God, and He was with God in the beginning. And then, so we don't miss it, that's where verse 14 comes, and that Word became flesh.
Yeah.
It makes that
So
beautiful.
so fascinating in that verse 14 when it says, and the word became flesh and lived. The actual Greek there is a fascinating word, which basically means he built his tent or tabernacled. If you remember back in the Old Testament, it was the tabernacle before the temple. It was the mobile tent that contained the Ark of the Covenant that truly represented the very presence of God among the people. It contained that Ark of the Covenant, contained the Ten Commandments, the Word of God. So, what I think John is trying to say to us is this in this profound mystery of who Jesus is as the Word of God, he is tabernacling. He is living in a tent among us. He is God's presence given to us. And I just think that's a whole fascinating dynamic that John introduces in chapter one. So then we kind of begin to explore the rest of the gospel, and chapter two is this fascinating conversation for me about one of the disciples says, "Here is the Lamb of God that comes to take away the sin of the world," and then they get into this fascinating conversation with Philip about, can this really be? He's from Nazareth, and I love that quote. Can anything good come out of Nazareth? That's such a that's such an ironic, fascinating little comment that is thrown in. Can anything good
Yeah.
come out of Nazareth?
Well, and I think that, I mean, to me, it really speaks to the humanity of Christ, the humanity of Christ, that he came from a real place that everyone knew, and it was kind of the armpit of, in their mind, it seems like the armpit of the country. Like, what?
Yeah,
But
yeah.
I
For
think,
us, I don't know where that place would be for you. For me, it might be Philadelphia. Hey,
well, no, for a Philly guy, it's from Jersey. You're from you're
yeah,
from Jersey.
yeah, yeah.
That's what we would say. But yeah, but I think it. I mean, I think that's where John John. Look, of all the disciples, the disciple whom Jesus loved, John has a very intimate relationship with Jesus, more so in some ways than the other disciples, and that is a real human to human connection that I think John experienced. And I think part of that, John is trying to like bridge the gap for us to say that he was my best friend and I knew him so well that I was the one that leaned on his bosom and I was the one whom he loved above all, or whatever, saying that all in a humble way, but also trying to make the connection that he's God.
Mhm.
I walked with him and I saw, and I think that's where John's gospel is unique. And maybe that's why, I mean, John doesn't spend time, you referenced this, but he doesn't spend time talking about Jesus's birth or Jesus's genealogy. He doesn't mention John's baptism, he doesn't mention the temptation in the wilderness, even the transfiguration, some things that you would think would be big events. For some reason, John doesn't put it. I think he's trying to create that connection of saying, I want to share what my experience of Jesus was differently. Kind of like, you've got three daughters and you've got grandkids and you've got friends, and everyone knows you and from a different angle, you know. And so your daughters are going to share something about you differently than I would share about you because our relationship's different. I think John's trying to give us a peek into my relationship's different, and I'm going to share why and how that is.
Well, that's good. That's good stuff. And so then we get to the chapter three, and I would say if there's any verse that is considered both the gospel in a nutshell, if there's a verse that most of us grew up being able to quote, it's John 3:16. For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, so that whosoever believes in him will not perish but have everlasting life. I think sometimes though that quote is lost in the context of chapter 3. It's Jesus having a conversation with Nicodemus, a Pharisee. Nicodemus comes to Jesus at night, which I think John has this fascinating way of dropping in these little bullets. He has the little blurbs that really shape the narrative in ways that are so subtle. But Nicodemus comes to Jesus at night. We kind of sort of interpret that to mean that that he really didn't want others to know that he was coming to Jesus. He was coming out of curiosity. He was coming out of a sense of really want to know who this is, but I'm not really sure I want others to know that I'm doing this. So Nicodemus enters into this conversation with Jesus, and fascinatingly, Jesus says to Nicodemus, "You need to be born again." What we've used that terminology. It's kind of fallen out of use, especially in United Methodist circles. But what do you know about that term "born again," Rod? What is Jesus saying to him?
Yeah, and I think Nicodemus was in a hard position, honestly. Like I think he had, like you mentioned, spiritual curiosities, but he couldn't wrap his mind around these spiritual truths. I mean, he was coming from the old wine, and this is new wine in an old wineskin, and he couldn't find a place. And I think so that born again statement, and you are right, it's definitely taken taken a turn over the over the last 25 years. Um, but I think what Jesus is speaking to is that this has to change. And this is not changed from the outside in, it's changed from the inside out. And I think that's what, when he's speaking to a Pharisee, and this is Jesus's claim about the Pharisees is you guys try to make the outside look clean, and it's all about out here, but inside you're a rotting tomb. You're decaying. And I think what he's trying to say to to Nicodemus, who's not understanding in real time, that the regeneration starts here. It's got to go. You got to be born again. Your heart has to be renewed. And he's trying as, I mean, as Jesus does, he's trying to communicate in a way, taking a spiritual truth and putting it into a physical illustration so that we can understand it. And Nicodemus was struggling with that because his orientation was all outward, you know?
Yeah. So I think we should compare contrast a little bit with the Matthew, Mark, and Luke. When Jesus confronts someone or is in conversation with someone, often he'll say something like, "Follow me," pick up your cross, or uh, give all your money away and just come walk with me. Really, an invitation to walk with Jesus. But here in the Gospel of John, in this conversation with Nicodemus, he says very much what you just said. There needs to be some heart change. There's got to be transformation. There's got to be a sense in which you're starting over. So it's fascinating. I think both are true. I think in one sense, if you want to come into a relationship with Jesus, one of the things you can do is just start going to the places where Jesus would be.
Yeah.
Go feed some hungry people. Go do some good work, and you'll find Jesus there. But as we all believe, in the end, the main thing that has to happen is transformation of heart. We have to recognize that we are broken and we stand in need of total transformation, body, mind, the whole being. So,
Yeah, and I think that's where Jesus, I mean, he obviously he's coming down as the Son of God, coming, leaving all the glory of heaven to come down to this just mess of an earth and trying to explain spiritual truths in ways that we can understand, which is I think why he uses illustrations like blindness. They understood what it meant to be blind, and he's using that same language to a Pharisee. You're blind to the spiritual realities, or he uses all kinds of daily like agricultural illustrations, the vine and wine and all these things to try to get them to understand. Because for all of us, we're trying to grasp a hold of something that is completely foreign to how we would naturally think. And Jesus being the master teacher, um, and he does it in a way like Nicodemus. I mean, Jesus's most um, aggressive venom was for the Pharisees. And yet we don't see that with Nicodemus. We see that Jesus actually speaks to him in a firm but loving way of saying, like, look, you're coming to me with curiosities. And even if John's writing this dig that it came at night, you're still coming. And I'm gonna share it with you. So where we see later on, he goes after the Pharisees, ruthlessly.
so there is this fascinating aspect of the Gospel of John that John often speaks about contrast. He'll
Yeah,
contrast light and dark.
yeah,
He'll contrast from heaven and from from below. He'll contrast good and evil. There is this interplay in John's gospel that often highlights the contrast and, put your mind on the things above, not on below. That's a fascinating aspect of John's particular way that he weaves his gospel together.
yeah. I think belief and unbelief, life and death, truth versus lies. He does a lot of that. So I think that's again that's one of the reasons John's gospel is so beloved because he's really helping you take concepts and sometimes we understand darkness better because there is light. We understand truth better because we understand what a lie is, and so doing that really is helpful for us.
So then there's this one chapter that we typically it's a pretty famous chapter, but it is somewhat controversial in the fact that many of the first versions of John's gospel don't seem to have contained this story, and that's the story of the woman caught in the act of adultery. If you're familiar with that story, this woman is caught, quote, in the act of adultery. I'll always find it fascinating that she's drug out, and what happened to the guy, we aren't told. But she's drug out, brought to Jesus as kind of this test case. Jesus, what are you going to do with this woman? She's obviously, been caught in this, and in that story, of course, Jesus looks at her, and then he bends down, writes something in the dirt. We aren't told what he writes, and then he stands up, kind of looks them all and says, okay, one of you guys who is without sin, you go ahead and cast that first stone, which would have been the prescription. It would have been allowed under the law. This woman caught in the act of adultery could have been stoned. And John tells us this story and says that they all begin to go away one by one. He ends up looking at her in the end and says, "Woman, did no one condemn you?" She says, "No," and Jesus says, "Neither will I. Go and sin no more." So this fascinating interplay between um, grace but also truth. Hey, don't get yourself into that position again. This while this chapter has seems to have been added, it is one of the beloved stories, and I think a fascinating chapter.
Well, and again, they're always trying to trap Jesus, and in this case, they're using the woman as bait because obviously it takes two to get involved in this sin that they were so anxious or so willing to try to expose, but one side of it, and I think it does expose that um, Jesus can't be played.
Yeah, yeah, he's on to their tricks and
Yeah.
not willing to gauge in that.
But
Uh,
it's a great picture. It is a great picture of the gospel. I mean, he's not ignoring sin, but he's also showing lots of grace. And I think it's obvious by the woman's demeanor. She's humble. She knows she's been caught, whether it was a trap and it was a setup or whatever. She knows she's been caught and she understands the law and she understands what she deserves and what she doesn't deserve. And I think that's the prerequisite of grace is that you recognize you don't deserve it.
absolutely, yeah.
So
Another one of my favorite chapters, and there are so many, again, Gospel of John, just can't wait for you to read it and read it with these eyes. So the passage in which the disciples are walking with Jesus and they see this man who's born blind, and they look at Jesus and because they respect his opinion, his word. Who sinned that this man was born blind? Was it him or his parents? And of course, what they're acting on, their belief is that sin is what happens to us. That's why the bad things happen in the world. They grew up this Deuteronomic theology that said if you sin, you get punished and bad stuff happens. But if you're good, then God's gonna prosper you and your life is gonna flourish and you'll be whole and well. They've been raised with that theology, and I love this when Jesus calls that theology into question. He says, neither of this man was born blind. It wasn't his parents. This man's born blind so that the glory of God can be revealed. Now, I don't claim to fully understand what Jesus is saying there, but I do find that this is one of those places where that whole theology is refuted, and that's so especially important. If we walk around and we think that our sicknesses, we think that our broken relationships, we think that the quote bad stuff that happens to us in our world is punishment for our sin, wow, that just introduces a whole new level of just bad theology and bad understanding of God.
Yeah. A couple years ago, many years ago now, I met a guy in Seattle, and he was about 25 years old, and I asked him what he did for a living, and he said he was retired, and I said, "Oh, really? You're retired at 25? How'd you retire?" And he said, "I won the lottery."
Mm,
I thought he was joking, so I looked to his friends, and I said, "Is he serious?" He says, "Yeah, he won millions of dollars last year." And I asked the guy, I said, "What's the hardest part about winning the $1,000,000 or winning the lottery?" And he said, "Knowing who your friends are."
mm.
And really hit me because we look at, even in our culture, if I told you I won the lottery, everyone would say, "What a blessing." But if you do the studies of people who won the lottery, many of them end up broke and penniless, and all the relationships are damaged. Why? Because money wasn't a blessing in that context. It actually hurt them. And I think we still buy into that, don't we? If we're doing well and we're driving a good car and our health is good and God's blessed us. And I'm not saying God hasn't blessed people in those positions, but I think God also blesses people who are poor and struggling. And how many times, I mean, you and I have been to other countries and we see people living in abject poverty, and they're happier than the people that we know who are in the $1,000,000 homes. So I think Jesus is trying to address a theology that's honestly needs to still be addressed today. It just looks different today, you know. No one's walking around with leprosy and we go, "Oh, that guy's cursed of God." But in other ways, we look at people and go, "Oh man, they're God must not be happy with them for this or that reason." And I think it's a dangerous, slippery slope.
So there's so much we could talk about the Gospel of John, but let's do at least mention the ending. If you look at the Gospel of John, chapter 20, it's the resurrection story. Jesus is raised from the dead. He has that beautiful encounter with Mary Magdalene at the end, and says, "Don't hold on to me. I've got to go to back to the Father." And so then that chapter ends and it says there's so many more of these things that we could fill volumes and volumes of what Jesus has done. And you kind of think that the Gospel of John has come to an end. It's a nice little concluding statement. But then we have chapter 21, which again seems to be a bit of an add on, but it's a fascinating story in which Jesus is walking along and he asks Peter three times, he says, Do you love me? And the first couple of times, I think Peter kind of really doesn't catch the glimpse. Jesus says, "Do you love me?" Peter says, "Hey, of course I love you, man. You're my guy."
Yeah.
And he says, "Then follow me, feed my sheep." And then the third time he asked Peter, "Do you love me?" And I think Peter kind of gets the threefold times that Peter denied Jesus. Jesus is asking him three times, "Do you really love me?" That's one of my favorite stories, a beautiful encounter that Jesus both, again, holds Peter accountable, reminds him, but also releases him and says, you're free to go out and serve and do the things that I've called you to do." And then, I just love that interplay.
Yeah. Well, think about it. The role that Peter played throughout the Gospels, and Jesus is like, "You're on this rock. I'm going to build my church." And Peter was the first one to raise his hand. "I'll do it. I'll say it." All the things. When Jesus was getting arrested, it was Peter the one who tried to defend him with a sword. So, if we did not have chapter 21, we'd all be left with the question of, "Oh my gosh, what do we do with Peter?"
Mm.
I mean, does Peter still the rock? Is he still in good graces? Like, there'd be a huge question mark for all of us. And because we all have sinned, we'd all go, "I wonder what God's doing with me. Like, is there hope? Is there redemption? Is there restoration?" All those questions. And 21 kind of circles back and says, "Yeah, there's still hope. There's still life. There's still forgiveness. There's still redemption, grace, all those things." So I think it's a beautiful ending. to a story, because without it, you just imagine what we'd all be thinking about how God handles sinners,
Mhm.
or or certain sins or whatever. But I think it's a beautiful ending. And John himself ends the book in chapter 20, but he says all these things were written. Everything in this book was written so that two things: you would believe and have life in his name.
Yeah.
And I think that is just a beautiful way for us to, I mean, God, John's goal is, I want you to believe because I believe, and this is real. And not just believe, not just hear, but I want you to have life, not in the things, in his name. And I think that's an awesome way to end this book.
So you're preaching on
I'm
Sunday here at
preaching.
Huntersville
Yeah.
United Methodist Church. What give us a little preview. Where you headed?
Well, as we're doing this study or reading the Bible in a year, and it's hard to just pick one chapter and verse out of an entire book or an entire gospel and say this is going to sum it all up. And we've tried to do that at times, but I decided foolishly, perhaps, that I'm going to try to tackle the entire book of John uh, in 30 minutes.
Hey,
Um,
easy done, yeah.
but the reason I wanted to do that is I think sometimes we don't take enough time to study. We study passages and we can go deep into a passage, but sometimes we don't see the bigger picture of
Mhm.
what is this book. And so I'm going to try to do a little bit of what we've done here in the podcast and try to do it in a way for just the book of John, and talk about as much as I can, respecting the time frame. But I hopefully people will walk away with understanding that this book was written so that they might believe, so they might have life in his name, and walk away with a better understanding of what did John bring about Jesus to us that the other gospel writers didn't. That'd be my goal.
Well, I know they're gonna be having a great sermon also at Denver, and for all of you Denver folks that might be watching this, encourage you to go and listen to, I'm pretty sure it's Steve this week, and, wish them all the best, that God's presence is there. We've got a big deal coming up on Sunday. We are having a vote on, selling some land that, we've discussed for a long time and with a lot of depth. So do encourage you, if you are coming to the 10:30 service, come early. Come about 9:45, sign in, be ready to vote at 10 a.m. If you're coming to the 8:30 service, we'll just plan to stay a few minutes extra and come on into the fellowship hall, register, be ready to vote at 10 o'clock. This is truly a major decision for the life of Huntersville United Methodist Church. So hope you'll plan to join us.
Well, thank you, Paul. This has been a good conversation, and appreciate it.
Right. Thank you, man. Looking forward to hearing what God puts on your heart on Sunday. For all of you, I hope you're able to continue to read, to grow in your understanding of the scriptures, and maybe these podcasts can help you just a little bit. But may the Lord bless and keep you.
God bless.